Your camera found the subject. The focus box was in the right place. The camera detected the eye. It confirmed focus. You pressed the shutter, and the photograph was still blurry. That sounds like an autofocus failure, but the autofocus system may have worked perfectly. The subject may have moved during the exposure. The camera may have moved. Your depth of field may have been thinner than you realized. Or the exposure system may have quietly lowered your shutter speed because of an ISO limit you set 3 months ago and completely forgot about. Autofocus is not one isolated setting. It's part of a chain. And when one part of that chain fails, photographers often blame the part with the little green box. Welcome to Your Camera Is Not the Problem, the photography podcast for anyone tired of confusing settings, questionable advice, and the feeling that better gear will somehow fix everything. I'm photographer and educator Joseph Nuzzo of ShutterSpeak and ShutterSpeak Academy. Around here we talk about decisions, skills, mistakes, and occasional equipment problems that shape our photography. Because sometimes the camera is the problem, but usually it's not. And better photography starts before the shutter button. Autofocus gets blamed for an extraordinary number of problems it did not cause. And to be fair, cameras encourage this. They put boxes around faces. They identify eyes. They track subjects through the frame. They display enough flashing symbols that it feels as though the camera should be able to submit a written report afterwards. But the final photograph does not care how confident the focus box looked. The photograph only records what happened during the exposure. By the end of this episode, you'll be able to separate a genuine focus failure from subject movement, camera movement, depth of field limits, and exposure settings that allowed the shutter speed to become too slow. You'll also have a simple process for deciding whether you need to change a setting, change your technique, or accept that the camera or lens may genuinely be the limitation. The distinction that controls this entire episode is simple. Did the camera focus on the intended subject? And was the final photograph sharp? Those questions are related. They're not identical. Imagine a person walking towards you. The camera detects the eye. Continuous autofocus follows the person. The focus box stays exactly where you want it. And the instant you press the shutter, the camera may have focused at the correct distance. But suppose the photograph was made at 1/80th of a second. During that exposure, the person continued moving. The camera focused correctly. The subject moved while the photograph was being recorded. That is motion blur, not necessarily an autofocus failure. Now, imagine that the person's eyelashes are sharp, but the tip of the nose and the ears are soft. The camera may have focused exactly where you asked it to focus. You may have simply had less depth of field than the photograph requires. Or perhaps the entire frame has a slight directional smear. The subject, the background, and everything else appear to have moved in the same direction. That may be camera movement. Those photographs may all be described casually as out of focus, but they are not the same problem. And changing the autofocus area will not solve all three. This is why the first part of reliable autofocus is a setting that does not control autofocus at all. Shutter speed. Shutter speed determines how long the camera records movement. Autofocus can identify the correct subject, direct the lens to the correct distance, and continue updating as that distance changes. But once the exposure begins, shutter speed determines how much movement is recorded. The subject can move within the frame. The camera can move during the exposure. and the subject can move toward or away from the camera, changing the distance at which the lens needs to focus. Sometimes all three happen at once, which is very considerate. A person gently turning their head does not require the same shutter speed as a child running toward you. A musician standing at a microphone does not require the same shutter speed as a hockey player accelerating through the frame. And a seated portrait does not require the same shutter speed as a dog changing direction because it has suddenly remembered something urgent in another part of the yard. Squirrel. You may have heard that your minimum shutter speed should be based on the focal length of the lens. That can be a useful starting point for reducing camera movement. It does not account for subject movement. A stabilized camera or lens may allow you to handhold at remarkably slow shutter speed. That can help keep stationary objects sharp. It does not freeze the person walking through the scene. Stabilization can reduce your movement. It cannot negotiate with the subject. So choose shutter speed according to what is happening in front of the camera, not only according to the focal length attached to it. There's no universal number. 1/500th of a second may be more than enough for one subject and not enough for another. 1/200th may work when a person is moving predictably and fail when a bird changes direction. The useful question is not, what shutter speed do photographers use for portraits? The useful question is, how quickly is the subject moving and how much of that movement am I willing to show? That sounds straightforward, but choosing the shutter speed is only the first half of the decision. The exposure system also has to let you keep it. This is where ISO and exposure mode become part of the autofocus conversation. ISO does not make autofocus more accurate by itself, but an overly restrictive ISO strategy can force the camera into a shutter speed that ruins the photograph. Here is a common version of the problem. You turn on Auto ISO, which can be extremely useful. Then you choose a low maximum ISO because you're worried about noise. The light gets darker. The camera raises the ISO until it reaches that maximum. Then it runs out of room. If the camera is still trying to produce a metered exposure, another setting has to change. Depending on the exposure mode and how you configure the camera, the shutter speed may begin to fall. Now, the camera is still finding the eye. It may still be tracking the subject, but the shutter speed is no longer fast enough for the movement. The result is a very clean-looking, blurry photograph, which is a remarkably inefficient achievement. A higher ISO may introduce noise. A shutter speed that is too slow may remove meaningful detail through motion blur. Noise can often be reduced during processing. It may also become far less noticeable at a normal viewing size or in a print. Important motion blur is usually much harder to repair. That does not mean high ISO never matters. Noise, color, dynamic range, processing demands, and the intended output all matter. But ISO should be evaluated as a part of the trade-off. It should not be treated as a number that must remain morally pure. The useful question is not how low can I keep the ISO? It is what ISO range gives the exposure system a reasonable chance of protecting the shutter speed this photograph requires. Your exposure mode determines how that protection works. If depth of field is the primary concern, aperture priority may make sense. You choose the aperture and the camera responds to changing light. But you still need to watch the shutter speed or configure the camera so it does not fall below a useful minimum. If movement is the main concern, shutter priority may make sense. You protect the shutter speed and allow another setting to respond, but the camera may eventually run out of aperture or ISO range, and the photograph can become underexposed. Manual exposure with Auto ISO can be especially useful when the shutter speed and aperture both need to remain fixed while the light changes. You decide how much depth of field you need. The camera adjusts ISO within the limits you have chosen. The camera is still making an adjustment, but that does not mean you surrendered control. Control does not require manually moving every setting. Control means knowing which variables must remain fixed and which ones can safely adapt. So do not choose an exposure mode because it sounds more advanced. Choose it according to what the photograph needs you to protect. At this point, the camera may be focusing correctly, the shutter speed may be appropriate, and the exposure system may be giving you enough room to maintain it. Now, we finally get to the part photographers usually change first. The autofocus settings. The first decision is the autofocus mode. For still photography, the basic choice is usually between single autofocus and continuous autofocus. On Nikon cameras, those are AFS and AFC. AFS is generally suited to stationary subjects. The camera requires focus, and once focus is established, it stops continuously adjusting until autofocus is activated again. That can make sense for a product, architecture, a landscape detail, or a person who is actually holding still. AFC is genuinely suited to subjects that are moving or may begin moving. As long as autofocus remains active, the camera continues adjusting focus as the subject to camera distance changes. That can make sense for sports, wildlife, events, children, pets, or any situation where please remain precisely where you are is not a realistic instruction. The important phrase is subject to camera distance. A subject can move sideways through the frame without changing distance very much. Another subject may appear almost stationary but lean slightly toward the camera and move outside a shallow depth of field. Choose the autofocus mode according to whether the required focus distance may change. And remember, AFC cannot compensate for a shutter speed that is too slow. Continuous autofocus handles changing distance. The shutter handles movement during the exposure. On Nikon Z cameras, you may also see AFF. That is a full-time autofocus mode used for video. Once the autofocus mode is selected, the camera still needs instructions about where and how to look. That is the job of the AF area mode. A small or single point gives you precise control. You place the point over the exact detail you want sharp. That can be useful for a stationary subject or when the camera might otherwise choose the wrong object. The trade-off is that you have to keep that small area on the subject. If the subject moves unpredictably, theoretical precision is not very useful when the focus point is now sitting on a tree. A wider autofocus area gives the camera more room to identify and follow the subject. That can help when the subject moves quickly or does not remain under one small point. The trade-off is that the camera now has more possible targets to evaluate. Subject detection can help the camera identify a supported person, animal, vehicle, face, or eye. That's useful. It's not magic. A box around the eye is evidence that the camera found an eye. It is not a certificate of sharpness. The camera can identify the eye and still be dealing with a shutter speed that is too slow, a lens that cannot respond quickly enough, an obstruction, poor light, shallow depth of field, or timing that was slightly early or late. 3D tracking can be useful when you identify a subject or detail and you want the camera to follow it through the frame. In a clean scene with a distinct subject, it may work extremely well. In a crowded or obstructed situation, another area mode may give you more predictable control. The smallest box is not automatically the most accurate choice in practice. The largest box is not automatically the easiest choice either. The right AF area mode gives the camera enough freedom to follow the subject without surrendering more control than the situation allows. The camera menu is often where photographers begin. They change the AF area mode, then the subject detection option, then back button focus, then another priority setting. At this point, we've changed 6 settings and frightened the histogram. Meanwhile, the original problem may still be a shutter speed of 1/80th of a second. So here is the full chain in a shorter form. Choose the shutter speed that matches the movement. Give the exposure system enough ISO range to maintain it. Use an exposure mode that protects the variables that matter. Choose AFS or AFC according to whether the required focus distance may change. Then choose an AF area mode that gives the camera the right balance of freedom and control. If those decisions are appropriate and the problem continues, the diagnosis changes. This is where the camera may actually be the problem. Older autofocus systems may struggle with fast or erratic movement. Some cameras and lenses perform poorly in low light. A lens may focus too slowly or inconsistently for the subject. Subject detection may struggle with obstructions, unusual angles, small subjects, or rapidly changing direction. The camera may lack the processing speed or tracking behavior the situation demands. Firmware and compatibility problems can be real, and sometimes the equipment simply cannot produce a high enough success rate for the work. Better equipment can improve reliability. It can make difficult photographs easier. It can increase the percentage of successful frames. It can recognize subjects more effectively and respond more quickly. The point is not to defend the camera regardless of the evidence. The point is to identify the evidence. A genuine equipment limitation is specific. The camera cannot reliably track the kind of subject you photograph. The lens cannot focus quickly enough in the conditions where you use it. The system becomes unreliable in the light you regularly encounter. That is useful information. The autofocus is bad, is frustration. The camera repeatedly loses a fast subject approaching directly in poor light, even with an appropriate shutter speed, AFC, and a sensible AF area mode, is a diagnosis. One may lead to another afternoon in the menu. The other may lead to a repair, a different lens, or a different camera. You do not need a laboratory to begin testing this. You probably already have the evidence sitting in your photo library. Find 10 photographs you have described as autofocus failures. Do not begin with the settings. Begin with the photographs. Look for the sharpest detail. If the background is sharp, the subject is not, focus may have been placed on the wrong object. If the eye is sharp, but the moving hands are blurred, autofocus probably worked, and the subject moved during the exposure. If the entire frame has a similar directional smear, the camera may have moved. If one narrow part of the subject is sharp, while nearby features are soft, the issue may be depth of field. If nothing appears sharp and the camera was using a wider AF area, the camera may have selected something other than what you intended. Then, check the exposure information. Was the shutter speed appropriate for the subject? Did an ISO limit force it lower? Did the exposure mode allow the wrong variable to change? Was the photograph made slightly before or after the important moment? Does the evidence point to lens behavior or an equipment limitation? You may not be certain in every case. That's fine. The goal is not to hold a trial and prove the camera innocent. The goal is to stop treating every soft photograph as the same failure, because every cause suggests a different correction. A focus placement problem may require a different AF area mode. Motion blur may require a faster shutter speed. Camera movement may require better technique, stabilization, or support. A depth of field problem may require a smaller aperture, more distance, or a different composition. An ISO restriction may require a more realistic limit. and a genuine equipment limitation may justify spending money. Your camera can find the eye, confirm focus, and still produce a blurry photograph. That is not a contradiction. It's a reminder that focus is only one part of sharpness. For the next episode, I would like to hear about an autofocus problem that has been frustrating you. Describe the subject, the conditions, the settings you remember, and what the photograph actually looked like. It may become the basis for a future listener question episode. Sometimes the camera is the problem, but before we convict it, we should probably question the other 4 suspects. This has been Your Camera is Not the Problem. I'm Joseph Nuzzo, and remember, better photography starts before the shutter button.